This is the Introduction to Forecasting part of my Operations Management course. I really love forecasting. I was a forecaster at Georgia Power Company before I finished up my PhD and got into teaching. Back then we used fax machines rather than email. Fax machines would have a cover sheet that went over the top of whatever it was you were faxing. What you see on the screen is the cover sheet that we used for faxing material out of the forecasting department. The quote says, "Forecasting is very difficult, especially when it's about the future." Lord Byron was a British poet and politician. According to him, the best prophet of the future is the past. I mentioned this warning in the overview, but I'll mention it again. Depending on your forecasting book, there could be a dozen or more sets of formulas. None of them are difficult. None of them are hard, but they take practice. You have to pay particular attention to keeping the data straight, what goes where, especially with the cumulative formulas where results of one formula feeds into another formula. So you need to practice. If your instructor takes up homework, you need to start it early, not wait till the last minute. You especially want to start it early so you have time to ask questions of your instructor if there's something you don't understand. I also mentioned this in the overview, but it's important, so I'll mention it again. Some of the calculations in forecasting are not standardized. Specifically, trend-adjusted exponential smoothing, also known as double exponential smoothing, and seasonality. If you're watching a video tutorial on these problems, whether it's from udemy.com or YouTube, make sure that the approach in the video matches the approach in your textbook. Because like I said, there are differences and you don't want to learn the wrong approach. I'm going to read you a quote, and before I read you the quote, in order to understand it, you need to know how a river gets shorter, specifically the Mississippi River. Rivers twist and turn. Sometimes they flood. When they flood, strong water can cut a new channel. Water likes to go straight so it can bypass the curves and go straight. When the flood recedes, the water stays in that shorter, straight path, and that way, the river gets shorter. Next up, you need to understand who Mark Twain was. He was a famous American writer, best known for writing fiction. In fact, most of what he wrote was fiction. But he did write his autobiography, Life on the Mississippi. You also need to know that he was kind of a caustic writer. I'm going to read you a quote from Life on the Mississippi. Part of what you need to know to understand this quote is that before he became a famous writer, Mark Twain worked as a riverboat pilot. In fact, that's the way he came up with his name. His real name's Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain is a pseudonym that he used for writing. If you want to know the story, you can Google it. From his autobiography, Life on the Mississippi. In the space of 176 years, the lower Mississippi, that's the lower Mississippi River, has shortened itself 242 miles, using the approach we talked about. This is an average of a trifle over 1 mile and a third per year. Therefore, any calm person who's not blind or idiotic, like I said, kind of a caustic writer, can see in the old eclectic Silurian period, just 1 million years ago next November, the lower Mississippi River was upwards of 1,300,000 miles long and stuck out over the Gulf of Mexico like a fishing rod. It's working backwards. We're going to end up calling that a backcast. And by the same token, any person can see that 742 years from now, the lower Mississippi will only be 1.75 miles long, and Cairo, that's Cairo, Illinois, and New Orleans will have joined their streets together and be plodding comfortably along under a single mayor and a mutual board of aldermen, also known as a city council. There's something fascinating about science. One gets such a wholesale return of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. What he's really saying there is that forecasts can be accurate in the short range. The further out into the future you go, or with a backcast, the further into the past you go, the less accurate they become. Now let's talk about Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was a famous rock and roll singer. When he died in 1977, there were 48 professional Elvis impersonators. I'm not sure how you became a professional. Perhaps you went to Graceland and took a test. In 1996, there were 7,328 professional Elvis impersonators. In 2002, the 25th anniversary of his death, there were over 35,000 professional Elvis impersonators. I live in North Georgia, just north of Atlanta, and out in the country, there are so many Elvis impersonators that there's a bar out in the country where on Saturday night they have an Elvis impersonator. It's a small bar. It's on a 2-lane highway even. If this rate of growth continues, in 10 years, 1 person in every 4 in this country will be an Elvis impersonator. Clearly, that's not going to happen. And again, it points out that as you go further into the future, forecasts become less and less accurate. I'm only going to talk about business forecasting, but I do want to bring this up. The United States has more tornadoes than just about anybody else in the world. In the 1950s, tornado deaths exceeded 500 per year. That was, in part, simply because we could not forecast tornadoes. Our forecasting ability with Doppler radar and other tools has greatly improved, And with today's improved forecasting, 50 to 60 people currently die from tornadoes each year. That's a tenfold reduction. We've gotten to where we can forecast tornadoes, or at least the potential for tornadoes, 2 days in advance. That allows people to take precautions. Now let's talk about electricity. In the 1950s, nuclear power was first coming to the market. It was seen as having tremendous potential. Rear Admiral Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, predicted that electricity would become too cheap to meter. In other words, it would be like basic cable. Have them hook you up to the house, no meter, use however much you want, same price. If you look at my electric bill, you can tell that didn't happen. So what is a forecast? It's simply a statement about the future value of a variable of interest. For us, it's a statement about the future demand for products and services. Before we get started, I went out and collected some interesting forecasts. And they're only interesting because they were wrong. If they'd been right, nobody'd pay any attention to them. Computers in the future may weigh no more than 1.5 tons. That's 3,000 pounds. Popular Mechanics, 1949. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM, 1943. I've got more than that in my house. There's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. Ken Olsen, chairman and founder of Digital Equipment Corp., 1977. Okay, let's move away from computers. The telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value. A Western Union internal memo, 1876. At the time, Western Union was a telegraph company, and the phone could be seen as a competitor. Who wants to hear actors talk? H.M. Warner, Warner Brothers, 1927. Airplanes are interesting toys, but of no military value. I can't say the name, but a professor of strategy at a French university. The last one, and my favorite. The concept is interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. This was a Yale University management professor. He was grading Fred Smith's paper proposing reliable overnight delivery services. Smith went on to found Federal Express. So we know who was right there. As I've mentioned, I was a forecaster for Georgia Power Company. So let's talk about how Georgia Power handled the forecast back in the 80s when I was working as a forecaster. They did 2 forecasts, a short-range forecast and a long-range forecast. Their short-range forecast went out 5 years. Their long-range forecast went out 20 years. They did the forecasting in 4 separate categories: residential, commercial, industrial, and other. And the other was mostly governmental. That's things like street lighting and traffic lights. I was the one in charge of residential forecasting. Some brief terms. A forecast, as you know, as we've talked about, is looking into the future. A backcast, as you know and as we've talked about, is looking backwards. That's useful with a forecast. You develop your model and you use some historical data to forecast to see how well you fit the results. But a nowcast is a statement about what's going on today, right now. Since I mentioned backcasting, let's talk about a backcasting example. And in fact, it's one of the better known backcasting examples. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, uses backcasting to verify climate models. Basically, they build a model or tweak an existing model and look to see how it handles historical data. The current climate model is the Global Forecast System, or GFS. NOAA is considering changes to what it calls its dynamic core. They changed part of the model called the VF3 dynamic core. They tested using backcasting and correlation between historical results and model predictions. A value of 1.00 is a perfect match. The higher the correlation, the better. Correlation goes up to 1. Here you see a model of the results. I'm not going to go into the model in detail because this is not about weather forecasting, but I just thought you'd be interested to see it. There are 2 main reasons to forecast: to either control the results or to react to the forecast. What does that mean? Well, let's say you're a manufacturer and you forecast that you're going to sell 20,000 units, but you have plans to make 30,000 units. What are you going to do? If you reduce your planned production from 30,000 to 20,000, then you're reacting to the forecast. If you lower your price, increase your advertising, make other marketing type changes, you're trying to control the results. Not everyone forecasts, and there are some reasons not to forecast. The biggest one is if you cannot control the results, and if you cannot change production. So, my stepbrother is a farmer. Once he plants his crops, he can't make any changes. Once the planting season's over, he can't plant more if he expects demand to go up. It wouldn't make sense to dig up the plants if he expects demand to go down. So a forecast doesn't do him any good. Another reason is if you're already selling everything you can make, or if forecasting is too expensive, if you're at full capacity and demand is going up, if you make a commodity product. We talked about commodity products in an earlier lecture. If you make a commodity product, you have no market influence at all. You're a price taker and a demand taker. If you're under a long-term contract, or if you're working closely with your customers to make exactly what they need. However, you may still need to do at least a minimal forecast, especially if your material that you order takes a long time to arrive, or if it's difficult to change production levels, or if you have to hire to change production levels. All of these require at least a minimal level of forecasting, even if it's just an educated guess. Forecasts do a lot more than just predict demand. Once you know the demand, you know what you're going to sell. Once you know what you're going to sell and you know what your collection cycle looks like, you have a good estimate of cash flows, or at least cash inflows. You can then turn that into estimates of profits. When I was forecasting at Georgia Power Company, it wasn't the production area that was always interested in getting the forecast as quick as possible. It was the accounting department for this very reason. The forecast tells you when you need to change production, increase production if demand is going up, decrease production if demand is going down. If inventory is an issue for you, the forecast can help you decide how much inventory to carry. Specifically, better forecasts mean holding less what-if or anticipatory inventory. That is, if you got a good solid forecast, you don't need to hold inventory just in case. The long-term forecast will tell you when to make major capacity expansions if demand is going up, or major capacity reductions if demand is going down. It'll also help you with strategic planning. All good forecasts contain a couple of elements in common. One, they're timely. If you're going to have to change production to meet demand, you need to know with enough heads up that you have time to make that change in production. They need to be accurate. That is, within some stated level, say you predict demand will be 30,000 plus or minus 10%. They need to be reliable. In other words, if you put the same data in, you get the same data out. They need to be simple to understand and easy to use, and they need to be cost effective. There's no point in spending more money on a forecast than the forecast is worth to you. The general steps to producing a forecast are as follows. Number one, determine why the forecast is needed. To schedule production, to schedule workers, whatever you're going to use it for. Number two, determine the appropriate time frame. Is it going to go out a few weeks, a few months, a few years? Number three, select your forecasting technique. We'll talk about the different techniques later. Number four, obtain, clean, and analyze the historical data. We'll talk some later on about what it means to clean up data, but basically you need good clean data because, as the old computer saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. Bad data into your forecast, bad forecast out. Number five, make your forecast. Number six, monitor the forecast to see how well it does. And in most businesses, you're going to repeat the process, although you don't have to go through all the steps. You already know why you're doing it, how long it's going to go out and all that. And you don't need to clean up the historical data more than once, although you do need to clean up the data as it comes in. So basically, you're repeating steps 5 and 6 for as long as you use the forecast. Forecasting plays a strategic role for the firm. Specifically, we're going to talk about supply chain management, total quality management, and strategic planning. With regards to supply chain management, forecasts tell us how many widgets we'll need. We then translate that into orders, production, cash flows, and all the things we've talked about. Forecasts about the technological advances and market changes help plan the future of the supply chain and our production. As I mentioned, forecasts tell us when to change capacity, increase it or decrease it depending on what demand is doing. Using a continuous replenishment system, also known as a vendor-managed inventory, does not eliminate the forecast, it just shortens the forecasting horizon. Basically, what it does in regards to supply chain management is the forecast tells us what we're going to make, when we're going to make it, and that lets our suppliers react with appropriate timing, minimizing the amount of what-if inventory in the entire supply chain. The supply chain holding less inventory reduces the inventory holding costs. That reduces the cost for everybody. With regards to total quality management, a good forecast allows us to be sure to have the products when they're demanded. We've all gone to the store to buy something, only to find out the store was out of it. That makes customers unhappy. That's a big part of TQM is keeping your customers happy, and so a good forecast helps you avoid the stock-out situation. As I mentioned, a good forecast helps you reduce inventories, which is a key goal of total quality management. Strategic planning is planning for the future, more specifically, planning for a long term into the future. If you don't have any idea what's going to happen in the future, you can't plan for it. For that reason, forecasting is central to strategic planning, and really, you can't do any sort of meaningful strategic planning without a forecast. The next video in this series on forecasting is my blacked out windshield story. That sounds like a strange title, I know, but that's probably the single best lecture you can listen to help you understand the nuances of forecasting, especially quantitative forecasting. Even if you skip some of the other videos, I really hope you listen to that one. If you enjoyed this video, please click like and consider subscribing to this channel.